Okay, retreat. All right, chat. We're gonna switch over now on stream. Got a kind of like a, I don't know if it's like a interviewee kind of thing or a conversation kind of thing, but we're gonna find out in a second here. So let's go check a look at that. Seconds to make sure all the audio levels are good. You guys hear me okay, chat?
If you want to keep playing Loop Hero, feel free.
I don't multitask like that very well. Although okay. I'm always kind of amazed at Destiny doing that, playing some game like the entire time he's having a conversation. I'm like, I couldn't track that.
To be fair, usually it's just jumping around in circles and something, but at least like Civ 5, that's been mindless for me. I haven't played it in like a year. Maybe you can advise me on a faith right now.
On a what, sorry?
A Pantheon.
Oh, Pantheon in Civ 5. Yeah, I don't think so. Anyways.
But
so my chat's asking kind of noticeably like who you are.
That,
yeah. So can you give me like a quick second intro of who you are and what you're up to and what we're doing today?
Sure. So my name's Chris. You can just call me Chris. Should I call you Filthy?
Yeah, it's my preferred online one for sure.
All right, Filthy. Feels a bit weird calling you that.
I kind of like that too. People seem to struggle a bit with using Filthy as like a name because they assume it's like a nasty adjective. So I don't mind that.
Yeah, you're breaking a lot of conventions there. Rose any other name. But yeah, my name's Chris. I'm usually known in gaming circles for running tournaments and doing fighting game stuff, Super Smash Bros. Melee. I don't know if you have any experience in fighting games, but I did find you through your old Civ 5 content long ago. And I've caught your stream once in a while since then. Then I caught your latest stream with Destiny, which spurred a lot of thoughts in my own head. So that's why I reached out to you to talk a bit more. Maybe just for myself and anyone in your own chat who doesn't know, what was your background in education, and then how did you go from that to research and from research to streaming?
Yeah, I was going to ask just before we do me, which I'm happy to do in just a second, but
okay.
What's your educational background? From the write-up you wrote me, it sounded like you had some graduate education. Is that right or no?
Yes. So my undergraduate was in physics and math from Rutgers University. From there, I kind of pivoted into the tech startup world. I got a master's in engineering in something called operations research. A lot of it was learning Python for data science and some low-level machine learning. And during that, I took some graduate level psychology in, I guess they call it HCI, human-computer interaction. And of course, I took like undergrad level psychology 101 courses, both of which I thought were very helpful. I think everyone should take one of these at some point in their life.
Cool. All right. So before I interrupted you to make you answer that, what were you asking?
Oh, just like, what was your education like? How did you go from that into research, and then how did you get from research into the streamer world?
Yeah, so I think I kind of stumbled into a graduate education, kind of. I finished when I finished my undergrad with a psychology degree. So I wasn't really sure what I wanted to do in undergrad, and ended up in psychology, kind of just from sampling classes and being like, hey, this stuff was really interesting. I think it actually was a social psych class that grabbed me into psychology. But when I graduated with my psych degree, an undergraduate bachelor's psych degree is just not very valuable. You don't have a lot of doors open for you with that. So I worked for I was pretty burnt out after college for that. So I worked for a year or two kind of with this degree, trying to get decent jobs, and just didn't really find a whole lot. And I sat down and was like, all right, well, I don't want to live my life like this. This isn't really working. So I need to make a change here. And I started applying to graduate schools. I applied to a community college, and my third backup plan, if I didn't get into either of those things, was going to be to join the military. And
interesting, military service.
Yeah, in the first year of applications, I didn't really know what I was doing, and my first year of graduate applications didn't go very well. And then my second year is actually when I got accepted into a couple different graduate schools for psychology. So that's how I ended up doing graduate school. So basically the first year I fucked it up. I didn't apply to enough places, essentially. And then, so I didn't get accepted into I think I applied to 3 the very first time. I was kind of doing this on my own. And the second time I did like the second year I did this massive search where I looked up every social psychologist professor in the US who was teaching, and looked through what they were researching, and then reached out to every single one of the ones I was interested in working with their research to. So I applied, I don't know how many actual places. I sent emails to probably maybe 100 professors or something, maybe a little less. And then I think I ended up applying to maybe like 15 universities or something for that.
Wow. Yeah. That actually sounds very similar to my path too, and how I took a gap, researched a bunch of different graduate programs, and eventually found one.
Yeah, because it's both a combination of you don't really know going into it. You know, like you might know like how school has a reputation, but on the graduate level, it's very different, right? Because you're really working with a much smaller entity than a school. You're working with essentially a professor or a department generally, and generally the people you're working with have research interests. And as a graduate student stepping into it, you're going to be working a lot with your advisors. Research interests. So it was kind of cool to start reaching out to professors as individuals and start talking about what they were doing and what they're looking to do in the future, and seeing kind of the disconnect between like their write-ups on the websites, but what they actually talk to you about. It was an interesting experience getting there. So
And were you always looking into relationship-based psychology programs? Is that like your focus?
so I entered. So I ended up going to Northern Illinois University, which is in Southern Illinois. It's in Northern Illinois, excuse me. And I entered that university working with one professor, and then changed kind of who my mentor was in that university after being there for a while. And I got sucked into what really did it for me is I took an evolutionary psychology class, and that just broke me for everything else. I'm like,
Yeah, that's actually a great one to talk about later.
yeah, and it's so damn interesting, right? So like the stuff I applied to work with, I was working with spontaneous trait inference is the research stuff, which is it's a pretty well mapped out field of psychology, and we were kind of sorting out minutia is kind of how I felt like I was doing there, and it was a lot of work and not super mentally engaging for me. Uh, and you know, I had this situation where I got accepted into two graduate schools the second year that I applied, and I got accepted into Northern Illinois University, and then I got accepted into the University of Hawaii. I think it was Manoa, I want to say. Can't remember exactly which of the Hawaii University. I'd have to look at where the locations were again for the public school Hawaii ones. So I ended up going to NIU because of the funding for this, right? So I got a full ride for both a stipend as well as waivers, right? So they pay me to go there, and went in with that kind of mentality that, hey, this is going to further my ability to do something with my life. It's hopefully going to be interesting. I was interested in psychology, and the stuff I applied for was reasonably interesting. But when I actually got to graduate school and started doing the work, I couldn't get away from the evolutionary psychology stuff. It was just too interesting comparatively. So
Interesting. Yeah, evolutionary psychology, that's definitely something that I don't know. It's something where I think once you understand more about how not just you work, but all life works on the planet to a minor degree, it really changes your thinking. And maybe I also want to ask you a bit about the military. Like, what about that appealed to you in getting your life on track? Do you think that's something where order and structure would be imposed on you and that would help you in that regard?
I think it was for me the realization that a bachelor's degree in psychology wasn't going to be opening doors and letting me lead the life I wanted to lead, you know? So I was when I first finished my bachelor's degrees, like I was barely making ends meet, just trying to work. It just didn't open enough doors. It didn't feel like my education was a valuable asset in my pocket there that was going to get me, you know, making money at a reasonable rate. It just felt like I was still on this kind of like college level, like starvation kind of existence. So for me, it was a practical thing. It was after that first year where I didn't, you know, how do I put this? I'm the oldest in my family. My mother did she has a master's degree, but she did it as an adult working. So she did it kind of night school. So I didn't really have anyone that I had really known. And the undergraduate university I was at didn't have graduate students there. So I didn't have a lot of experience with the process of getting into graduate school. And I didn't have a lot of mentorship for that. So that first year of just applying to those three schools really kind of put it in place that, hey, you didn't do that well. I didn't approach that in a good way. So that second year when I'm sitting there, you know, I worked a whole year in between that first failure of those applications before I then did that next round of application process. And the thought in my head was, look, I don't want to do another year. If I don't get in this year, I'm going to have some backup plans. I want to have something tangible in my life that's going to move forward. And community college was one of them. I thought, well, if this higher education doesn't work out in that sense, then I can get a tech degree of some sort and then jump into the workforce fairly immediately after that. Or then if I didn't get into that as well, I'm just like, well, fuck, I'm going to do something that gets me doing something that's more more of a road to advancement than where I was. I was working these kind of dead end jobs that really weren't going to go anywhere. So the military wasn't so much as it was something that was standing out to me as something I particularly wanted to do, but it was standing out as an opportunity that I could have chosen in that moment.
Got it. I think I understand now.
Okay.
So, I guess getting back to like where you left off on the end of your talk with Destiny, it was a lot about the changes that you undergo internally and how you undergo those changes. There are external influences, which are your relationships with people, which you have a lot of experience with. And then there's the internal, the ego driven, I guess stubbornness is another word for it, that prevents these changes from coming. And part of the framing of this conversation is just how technology has shaped the world in that it's not so much a filter bubble anymore, but that you can look at the world and see what you want to see, a reflection of information that backs up your own mentality, either in political things you believe in, like what brands are better when it comes to hypochondriacs, what medicine will cure them, or what the next fad diet would be. So I wanted to get a little bit of your thought on how do you change yourself most effectively, which is a pretty broad topic, I know. Were there any things that you did that helped you overcome any internal biases or like opened your mind to changing this stuff?
Yeah. So it's interesting seeing you describe ego as stubbornness. That's not really the feel that I get when or the feel I get about the thing I'm calling ego. For me, ego is often the inability to kind of separate from the moment to moment emotions you're feeling when something happens, and not being able to take perspective is more of that than stubbornness for me. So ego might be, hey, my girlfriend said, or my wife said something shitty to me in this argument. And rather than kind of take a step back and be like, hey, this is her talking in the heat of the moment, I fired back a witty retort in the moment and just escalated the whole fucking thing. Right. That's ego, much less than stubbornness. Stubbornness might be like perseverance, or you're just kind of going to bite down and suck it up and deal with it. For me, ego is the impulses, the kind of natural impulses that you're working with that get in the way of what you actually want for your objectives.
Got it. I think that is a better definition now. I like how you frame it there.
Okay, so when I think about things, so when I think about changing things that I want to change about me or improving my life, I like that on a top-down level, right? I like that on the idea of, well, I can plan and reflect. Look at what it's very actually similar to getting to choosing to go to graduate school, right? Which was, I look at something in my life that I want changed. In that case, I wanted, my position in the workforce change, right? I wasn't happy with this as a career. It wasn't going anywhere. My degree wasn't doing anything for me. So that kind of the higher level then construct goes, well, I want to make a change here to something that's more engaging, something that was going to be more interesting for me, more engaging for me, and pay more. And then planning from there. So when I think about that, for example, relationships or just in general, for me, it's almost always a top-down approach. So once I identify what I want, I can then start moving the pieces to make that happen. And I don't think a lot of times that people reflect on this. I think the conversation with Destiny, one of the moments, not to go on too much about this, but one of the moments that really, for me in graduate school, was so eye-opening was seeing relationships be different. To see, by working with these kink communities, seeing all these other types of relationships that I didn't know could exist. And why does that matter? That matters because when you're stepping up at that kind of high level, looking down of like how the top-down approach in this, knowing what your options are is a big portion of that, right? If you don't know you can do option Z, you can't plan to make option Z a reality. So for me, graduate school was really good about showing me all these things I could change if I had the interest to do so.
Okay, that definitely leads to the next topic then, which is how external influences can help shape your reality and make you realize you have these options. I think a big thing people deal with, especially in the pandemic and especially dealing with modern technology, is this idea of depression or just inability to change the world around them, or just feeling insignificant. And a lot of times they're family members who, let's say, have someone they know who's stuck in QAnon conspiracy, who's like lost and trying to find meaning in these things. We want to reach out to them, but it's very hard to get through that ego, whatever you describe that as, or if there's any other aspects to it we could talk about. So you say it's a very top-down approach, but the difficulty I see is that these people can then look to technology, look out to the internet, and see reflections of everything they need to justify it from their top-down view. At what point can we, as people in their lives, like reach in and try to like break that up gently, or you know, what is the most effective strategy to help bring them back to reality?
Yeah, it's there's a lot loaded up into that. I suppose on some level, I don't feel responsible for doing that. If we're looking on kind of a societal level, like how do we do this? How do we approach this societally to do this? Maybe I could start poking at some answers there.
Let's do that. Yeah.
Okay. I think that sometimes people don't want to change particularly, right? So you not only have the issue of how do you convey information that's more accurate or more factually based, but you also have how do you get people to care, or how do you get people to engage with that? And at least from my experience, in the same way that, you know, I was talking to, I described it to Destiny as basically being a relationship nerd, right? Like both my wife and I ended up in graduate school for relationships essentially. And it turns out we're both really interested in talking about things about this and thinking about these things. But if you take my car, for example, I don't give a shit about my car. I don't care how it works. I don't care what I need to do, what I could do to make it better. I don't care how I could improve it. I want to turn my car on, go somewhere, come home, turn my car off and not think about it again. So on some level, I think one of the challenges you face is you gotta, and it's gonna be of course domain specific for this, but you're gonna deal with the fact that people aren't always interested. So sometimes when we talk, when I see these kind of factual disputes, right, which is such a weird one, right? If the people aren't interested in engaging factually, or aren't interested in engaging, we could say honestly too, maybe is another one, right? Like if this is essentially a front for an ideology, or it's a front for virtue signaling, or it's a front for, you know, just beating on someone on the internet, for example, you might not be able to reach them like that because they don't have the motivation to do it. So I guess maybe some domains here. So like, who are you thinking when you talk about this? Like, what is your target? Is this a friend who, you know, like you have some vested interest in their life and they've wandered off some path? Is this a loved one? Like, how are you?
I think there's a lot of people. I don't want to be too specific, but there are people who have either fallen into the idea that they are helpless, they are hopelessly depressed, they have no hope in the world. And then there's the other extreme of people who have felt depressed and have been motivated by these ideologies, which is good because it gives them life, but it, you know, skews it in a wrong direction. It's really hard to pinpoint it there. So maybe we can pick a specific topic. I think ultimately it's how does technology influence this sort of personal change? And are there any strategies you found to help yourself like fight back against this?
So I have some luck in that I'm a fairly private person, and my dad is, or was before he retired, was did a lot of internet security kind of stuff. So I've been a little reluctant to engage heavily with platforms like Facebook or something like that, right? So I get a little shielded from the fact that my paranoia, perhaps, of having all of my data accessible to everybody all the time has left me a little out of those fields. Like I don't engage heavily with Twitter. I see Twitter as a brand thing for my channel mainly. I've never been involved with Facebook. I think I was on it very briefly and then kind of was like, this isn't helping me. This is like get drunk and look at ex-girlfriends kind of things, or you know, like I'm not seeing a lot of probative stuff that's useful to me, right? When I reevaluate on that. My wife's not on social media particularly either. So part of it is maybe if you're stuck in these you know, the buzzword is echo chambers, right? But if you're stuck in these kind of like these reinforcement groups and these reinforcement patterns, one way to stop that being so influential on you is to step out of them. So I'm not saying that everyone needs to like get off Facebook, for example, or get off Twitter, but if you're really looking to, and again, if you have the motivation to do this, if you're looking to evaluate your life, how much is that adding? What do you get out of it? And it might be that it's very useful for you in some domains and you can restrict it to those domains. But some of it is getting your head out of that kind of ecosphere. The depression element is interesting. So I want to be clear, like my background is a research psychologist in social psychology, looking at relationships. I have no clinical training and I have no interest in being a clinical psychologist of any sort. So I don't want to sit there and listen to other people's problems as a profession and then try to help them. I think it's very valuable for the people doing this, but that's never been something that I personally wanted to do. Speaking personally about times in my life when I'm down, unmotivated, or depressed, those things for me have always been benefited by, again, having a goal. So when I can see progress towards something, that's always super helpful for me. So if I'm in this, like, again, like that scenario right after undergrad is a very good example in my life, again, because it was all these things are related and tied up in one. I was unhappy with what the outcome of my undergraduate degree was, frustrated with the lack of doors it was opening, and spent some time living that life realizing I didn't want to be in that life as it was anymore. So for me, that was, okay, well, what can I do about it? I'm a competent, educated, intelligent human being who has one life that I'm in charge of. So on some level, there's a bit of motivation from that. Some of it is, of course, reaching out to your kind of support networks, working with your friends or your family to kind of get some sense of what that is. Some of it's just like, well, what steps can I do? What are the types of steps that are available to me as a person with that background and that experience? So that was kind of useful to me. And then, I don't know, there's a lot of little small things that really help my quality of life. Things like being physically active, things like having a fairly reasonable sleep schedule, things like having a loved one who I care about. These things are all helpful for me for maintaining kind of day-to-day upbeat motivation. I don't know if that's kind of what you're asking about.
No, I would agree on all those. I would say introducing those to my own life helped a lot. It's definitely hard to get to that motivation point sometimes, depending on your situation. But physical change also benefits your mental change. That's the thing people forget.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that I'm repeatedly excited about when I learn about psychology is the influences that you're not aware of and how powerful they are on you. So having some understanding of that about yourself is really, really useful. Like I do this with my wife all the time now. Like I am more likely to be like, if she's like, hey, you wanna go out for drinks with some of my work friends tomorrow or something, I'm very likely on a short-term notice, just if she just asked me that question, be like, nah, not really interested, kind of deal, right? So I know with her, when we have this thing now where she's like, she loves to present these ideas and carry through with them, right? So she's real good about being like, hey, let's go on vacation. And if I say yes, we're gonna have vacation booked for tomorrow, kind of deal, Like she's like one of these people. So for me, when I interact with her, it's really important for me to know where my headspace is. So if I've had a long day and I'm tired and kind of down after it, now is not a good time for me to be talking about future plans of vacations, because I'm just going to shoot them all down, kind of deal. And that is in previous, and maybe it doesn't seem like perhaps I haven't chosen a good example for this. It may not seem particularly impactful for that, but the difference goes, these are things that I often will enjoy and have a good time with once I've committed to them and not kind of felt like I'm forced into it, kind of deal. But if I just react with my normal kind of ego, if I react in that moment without a second's reflection or stepping back or being like, hey, come back at a different time to talk about this, I end up sabotaging these opportunities for myself because of how powerful that impact of kind of that moment to moment is on me. So if I don't know I'm tired and I react to people, I'm going to struggle with that. If I don't know I'm upset and I'm going to interact with people, then I'm going to struggle with those outcomes, right? These are things I can do better and get to do better because I know more about myself. So that felt like that kind of same thing to me a little bit, right? Which is for what we're talking about. The more you know about yourself, the better, and the more you understand even the things that are impacting you that aren't on the conscious level, like for example, how much exercise helps my general mental well-being. Like having this piece of knowledge about myself lets me do what I want more regularly with less problems because of that. And that to me is always really interesting, to experience these things that give you that insight.
Yeah, I definitely agree with your idea of forcing yourself into a mindset. Like even the act of just scheduling something in advance that I wouldn't want to do in the moment helps me eventually learn to appreciate it. So that's one hack I've sort of incorporated into my own life. I guess that also brings up the idea of having willpower in the moment, though, because you have to overcome your ego. So on one level, we know that I don't know if you believe in the idea that willpower is like a resource. You have a finite amount per day. Do you think sleeping on it is like the solution in most cases, or just getting out of that mindset for a while?
Yeah, so willpower is a double-edged idea for me. When I was in graduate school, the major theory that was put forth was kind of the willpower as a muscle kind of deal, right? And I've heard that's gotten pretty heavily torpedoed in the last period
Okay.
of time.
Yeah, I didn't want to say. All right.
So I don't know what the literature says for that exactly these days. But either way, willpower has never been a very good motivator for me. And my solution to this has always been to build systems as opposed to for example, let's say that I'm just trying to keep some regular amount of physical workout. Maybe like I'm trying to bike a couple times a week, like go on a fairly long bike ride, like 3 times a week or something, right? I can do it one of two ways. I can be like, hey, that's my goal. And then Tuesday comes around, I go, how do I feel about bike riding today? I don't really feel like it. Wednesday comes around, how do I feel about it today? I don't really feel about it, kind of deal. Or I can just sit down and be like, okay, I'm going to bike on Saturday, Tuesday, and Thursday. And then when that time rolls around, I'm not using willpower in that moment. It's just what the routine is. I just built a structure that advances my goals without letting me have the leeway in that moment of backing out of that. And for me,
Yeah.
that
So
tends.
just the idea
Go
of
ahead.
routine overcoming your own mentality.
Yeah, like again, like if I want to get something accomplished, it doesn't necessarily matter if I'm not feeling great about it in that moment, right? I suppose there's extremes. If I'm like, have some extreme cold and I'm super sick and like twitching in bed or something, maybe I can't do it, kind of deal. But in general, I don't want to ask how I feel about the idea of doing something that I'm doing for another reason. Especially so if I can build that into just a regular occurrence, that's just a better way for me.
Okay, I could agree with that too then. Um, so are there any routines that have helped you? Like, do you have a daily routine of getting up, exercising, eating certain things?
It's more flexible than that for me. For me, it tends to be like, well, what routines are working, and then building off them, and then discarding the ones that don't as much as well for that. So, for example, recently, like I've been doing yoga with my wife. Like we finish work, we go down, we do a little bit of yoga together, kind of deal. That's been really nice. In the past, it might have been something like, as I said, for like running, or I've been a runner for a large portion of my life and switched to biking as a physical exercise, or we did rock climbing for a number of years and looked to get back into that. It, so it might not be as specific, rather it will be more specific than I want to work out, right? That's a good starting point. That's a good spot. Like I want to be physically fit is a good kind of goal. But the trick then is to make that a specific enough set of steps, and then to automate that set of steps, and then to touch back on that only when you need to change it, right? So if I'm going to do Saturday, Tuesday, Thursday for a workout, that's in my mind what happens at 6 p.m. each day. We're going to go do XYZ on Saturday, Tuesday, and Thursday. And I might come back to that later and be like, hey, I'm going to change this up for something else. So
Got it.
yeah, for at least for me, that tends to be how I get around my kind of inherent laziness, is I don't ask. It's not an option at that point. It's just kind of what we're doing.
So one other thing, and maybe you can approach this from an evolutionary psych level. I just think humans have not adapted to the levels of social media and technology we have. So I'm actually very curious. One, how do you interact with technology? What do you consider it in your life? And then two, do you have habits built around that maintain a healthy relationship there? And not being on social media is a great first step, but anything else like notification silencers or stuff like that?
Yeah, it's fascinating. I don't remember which, this is probably a Joe Rogan podcast somewhere, but I don't remember his guest where this conversation came up. But essentially, they were equating humanity, by and large, in the last few thousand years, really hasn't done a lot of physical evolution, right? There's certainly been societal changes, but by and large, we're a very similar physical species that we've always been for that time period. But technology has changed exponentially and continues to increase in the speed at which it changes exponentially. And I think there was a documentary recently looking at the impact of social media, and they were talking about if you have a system that's getting smarter and smarter, that's designed to essentially steal your attention, and you match this versus essentially a stationary, like non-changing system like the human brain, by and large, you're at a really big disadvantage for that. So
Yeah, we're optimizing for the Skinner box, the dopamine. Like it's
yeah,
a very scary reality.
and as far as I'm concerned, the cards are really stacked against me on that. So I certainly, I guess this ties in for willpower for me. I don't want it to be a willpower decision every single time on that, because my chances of succeeding at that are going to get worse as the technology gets better, are going to exhaust me over time as I repeatedly decline something that I apparently want to do, and I'm going to lose for that. So I don't want to set myself up in a situation where I'm going to fail. Just doesn't seem like a setup for that. So I guess from my perspective, when you ask what are my routines around that, I don't dislike technology. I mean, I live a large portion of my life online. I love games. My wife watches a lot of television, etc. Like these things are fine. if you're okay with them in kind of the larger scheme of your life. So I think, you know, you kind of get the psychology of this of, well, when are things a problem? When is pornography a problem? When is internet a problem? And it's essentially when it negatively impacts your life. So where's that boundary on that? It's going to be different for different people. Some people seem to be just fine on social media. It's just not really been something for me. So I guess temptation wise, I'm not sure I feel it so much as a temptation. Like what behaviors are you asking about avoiding? Like avoiding like checking Twitter repeatedly, avoiding checking content repeatedly? Like, is there something less broad than technology in general?
For me personally, I definitely found that getting rid of Twitter, or at least the apps on my phone, and just using my phone less in general was the best thing I could do. I purposely used an old phone for several years because of that, and now I feel more comfortable and I have a more modern phone, so I'm able to engage with that more healthily. But
Yeah.
in terms of other tech, oh, go ahead.
No, I was just gonna say that I think that I also have an old phone, and I also have been told in the past by some people that I've been in situations where people are like, oh, it's really nice you're not always on your phone, and my mentality with the phone is very similar to what you've just described, which is it's a functional thing that I want for some smaller portion of my life. Maybe that helps the break of I do all my work online at my computer, and I don't really think of my phone as like a gaming platform. I don't really think of my phone as a social media platform. I mostly think of a phone for like texting or calling people. So maybe that does help to some degree, that you're not carrying, as you said, you're not carrying around that distraction in your pocket all the time that you could play with.
Yeah, and I think also I saw it as if I had a more fancy phone with more bells and whistles, more games, I would eventually become addicted. Even if I think I'm comfortable with it now, like you said, we are now optimizing for a future where it's being sold to you in this way, and you're going to have to interact with it more and more each day. So maybe it's a bad trade-off because I'm still sitting in front of a computer much of my life, but that was one small area where I eventually like got over that phase and was able to upgrade a phone and felt comfortable with apps again.
Yeah.
It's a weird way of putting it.
Yeah, no, I think I agree, and I think I can apply that a little bit to what we're talking about before again, which is that knowing yourself is really important for getting the desired outcomes that you want. And if you know that you are likely to pick up a phone and play with it, if you have that game installed on your phone, well, that just suggests you should remove that game off your phone, not leave yourself in that position where you have to decline it every single time, because you won't. You'll fail at that, and you'll set yourself up in a position to fail. So I agree.
Another thing that I was going to ask you about was unrelated to social media, but more about your workflow, because I think another area where humans are not fully or evolving quick enough is how we work with technology on a day-to-day basis. Because whether you like it or not, you're going to have to email people, you're going to have to use Discord, Slack, something to work with others. I work in a fully remote company. We're all this sort of fractional employment model. We work all around the world. So a lot of what we do when it comes to UX and company policies around making communication easier between people. So, given this world where I have to embrace the idea of being plugged in 24/7, and I know that's lifestyle going forward, what are some things that I guess like non-social media technical habits that you put in place to like manage that relationship? I could get more specific maybe if email is not something you relate to.
I'm thinking about this. So I guess I hit this at a couple of levels. So one of them to me is boundary management, and I'm not sure how much leeway everyone has in their own professions with this, right? So you may, for example, one of my viewers, long story short, who one of my long-term viewers of this is a lawyer in Singapore, and his work has him working overseas, and it's an expectation of his job that he be available during time zones that are not the time zone that he's in. And that would be brutal for me, because part of how I manage this stuff is I essentially delegate periods of time where I will be dealing with admin, right? For me, for the admin stuff for the channel. And that's generally my days off. It's generally Monday or Tuesday. I generally take a fairly small snapshot of that and try to engage with it during that snapshot and enforce that the rest of the time. That I can. The two things that come to mind is I had a professor who told me once that work is infinite and time is not. And I think that's a good approach to things in general. And then B, it feels like a value thing for me, which is if if I am constantly at the beck and call of the people I'm working for and they're not compensating me for that, and I can't have a life because of that, that seems to me to be extremely problematic. So email email for me was a drag for a long period of time. So it basically started as, okay, you have this channel, you have this streaming channel, this YouTube channel that's growing and has more and more stuff being thrown at it, both for like cold calls, but also for things to do, stuff I could do with that. Some of that was outsourcing. So for me, I have a community manager who I have do some of that. Some of that was restricting the time that I felt responsible for it, basically saying, hey, I will check this every so many days for a certain number of hours, hitting that and then walking away from it. And some of that was trying to clarify in my own mind what those relationships were. You know, what do I owe this person? And what am I interacting with them for? So particularly for a lot of cold call emails to my email account, those are pretty low priority things for me overall. I don't want those intruding when I don't have that time in mind for that. I don't want my phone beeping at me. I don't want my phone notifying me that I need to come back. I don't want a bunch of pop-ups on my desktop when I come back. You know, I want all of this out of there. The stuff that's attacking my attention needs to not have the leverage to get that, except on the terms that I'm willing to give it. From my perspective, and I don't know how well that works for people whose jobs don't allow that. Perhaps you could speak to that a bit more. It sounds like you're at a networking from home kind of job.
Yeah, I think I'm in a fortunate position where a company is pretty forward thinking when it comes to your work-life balance, but this is a thing where now every company is getting forced online because of the pandemic, and it is a lot of culture change, and people are not fully understanding that you don't need to be fully present when you're online. So I'm sure that applies to some people's life. Another thing was you mentioned the idea of like picking up projects, putting them down, and I wondered how this played into the idea of your own personal motivation. So are you somebody where you pick one project and you have to focus that time on it? Or do you like this idea of juggling small things and incrementally improving on them? Is that a way to sort of balance your attention better?
Let's think about that. So the approach differs. From a productivity standpoint, hopping tasks, I
And
think,
that's where I was going with this. Yeah, the technological issues with jumping tasks.
yeah, I think it's more than just technological too. I think it's fairly hardwired, right? It's just that people aren't super good at rapidly picking up tasks, switching tasks, and especially multiple tasks at the same time. There's some, I can't remember where the source was now, and I feel bad about this because you're asking me questions where there's actually literature that suggests this. My recollection of the literature is essentially people are really bad at multitasking, and even people who think they're quite good at multitasking, once they're actually multitasking, they lose a fairly high amount of the information they're doing. So rather
Yeah.
than being extra efficient, they're essentially being less efficient. That's certainly how it works for me personally. My anecdotal kind of feelings with that are, if I'm working on something, I don't want to be working on 5 things at once. I want to be working at one thing at once if I can. So yeah, so at least for me, that works that way for me.
So is that something that you figured out over time, or did you always work that way? Because I definitely remember periods of my life where I thought I was more efficient having 100 tabs open and, really buying into the idea of technology managing your life in a certain way. I think that's a narrative people see a lot in the tech world, that the idea that technology can solve our problems like this. So is that something where an experience changed your idea on it, or were you always just adverse to, switching too much using technology in that manner?
I mean, it's definitely experience based. There's no way that I nailed anything first time ever. This stuff is so counterintuitive to how at least I think about life. No, it's from looking at it and reworking that system in my life at some point. At some point, I got very. It was before I hired my community manager for my channel. I was getting very frustrated with the amount of admin that I was doing for my channel and how much I was hating it. So it came at essentially addressing that kind of broke down that way, that look, I'm trying to do 20 things at once here. I don't need to be doing this. I should be delegating here is really what I should be doing in this scenario, because it saps my creative and mental energies from the things that I enjoy, the things that I think are important to my stream, and it's business related to that, which is important as well, but it's not the passion for me, and it can be outsourced to somebody else. So
Interesting.
yeah.
So I guess is one of your stances on this that if the 100 tab approach works for someone, that means it's good? Because I sort of agree with the literature that this is necessarily a worse way of working. You get worse quality, worse attention. and seems to lead you toward this lower attention span lifestyle that is, detrimental in the long term for your health. So, is this something we have to worry about, I guess?
I think, is it something we have to worry about? I don't know.
Like, if you cared for a friend that did this, is
Hmm.
it necessarily something that could hurt them in the long run?
So I think I value a fair amount the idea that you're going to be doing what both works best for you. But I think it's really the caveat for that is that I'm not always aware of what's best for me until I've gotten there. So I may be doing something that is my method for doing that, and there may be a much better method out there for it. So do I think some people handle like this insane multitasking with like 25 emails going? Yeah, I've seen people doing that. I don't know what the long-term health repercussions of that are, and perhaps they aren't. Perhaps this is something that you do for a short period of time with a very successful career in something, and you walk away from it having major money for that kind of deal. I don't know. It has never been very sustainable in my life when I get to those situations. I find it stressful. I find that my work suffers in terms of especially creative energy. I find that I get very frustrated with it. It's never worked well for me. There are plenty of people out there doing things like that, but I suspect that what you want is you want an organization scheme that works for you. And as soon as you start calling it as cluttered as you keep using the 100 tab example, I can't imagine a 100 tab organization scheme that's really working for someone. That sounds like someone who is overwhelmed. So there's probably some point much more complicated than what I've used in my life, but I don't know that super complicated is the way that's really going to work for that. At least my take on
Yeah,
it.
I think that goes back into our previous discussion about self-changing. I don't know what it was or when it was, but there was a time where I just closed my tabs one day, put them all in a folder, and the anxiety from doing that was very high. But something triggered me to do that, and my life was better for it. So I wonder, like, again, I just think it's a matter of humanity adapting either legal policy or just understanding our relationship with technology better. But this is going to mess us up in 50 years if we're not more aware of how these things impact us day to day.
This is messing us up now. This is messing us up
Of
as a
course, yeah.
society right now. Not only the echo chamber stuff, but you see the mental health issues with this generation, and the longer it seems to be essentially the longer people have been exposed to this nonstop social media, nonstop kind of internet attention feasts going on, that the worse off they are with health outcomes. So it's definitely going to fuck us up long term not doing something about it. So the ability to interface with our technology in a way that we can handle is super important. And the problem is, at least from my perspective, that the incentives are misaligned, right? So as long as you are employing very smart people with a lot of background in this, using the most advanced tools with essentially an endless amount of money poured into it, and you're pitting this against every person as an individual with their own finite resources dealing against this, it seems very heavily tilted in the favor of the corporate for that, from my perspective. So yeah, you asked the question, what can you do about it? I don't know that there's I don't know that there's a broader, I don't know that there's a giant answer to that, right? I feel like the most useful level to approach it from as an individual becomes, what can I do in my life to make my life better and to mitigate those impact on my life as much as possible, you know? And maybe that, for me, again, this would be how but I think about these things this way, and not everyone does, right? I think about these top down, which is, well, am I okay with my consumption of media? Am I okay with my time spent in these domains? Do I want that up or down? Is it negatively impacting my relationship with my wife, or is it negatively impacting the things I want to do? And checking in from time to time to evaluate that lets me say if I need to be more or less severe on that. And at least from my perspective, that's worked for me, and it hasn't been a major component of my life issues with that. So I might be getting lucky with that more than I am offering a solution.
Yeah, maybe. I think we're similar age. I'm going to be 30 next year, but I feel like this is even weirder to approach from the idea of someone who's been born into technology and doesn't remember the world before it, when it was a little bit more analog. Um, like, even the idea of having an echo in your house, and a kid is raised every day saying, Alexa, turn lights on, Alexa, turn, open a door, whatever. And one day Alexa doesn't work. What sort of mental damage could that do to a person who's raised in society to expect this from technology all the time? Um, I think we see it when humans panic in mass groups when there's power outages or other natural disasters too. So I don't know. I feel like yeah, educating yourself at the personal level, psychologically, especially evolutionary psych, helped me understand how technology influences my life, and then therefore, what are some policy we should use for it going forward as humans.
Yeah, and again, I don't know that it works for everyone because I'm not sure everyone's interested, right? Like again, this is cars for me, I don't care, but this is relationships for me, which I care immensely about. So I think you might not reach everyone with that mentality, that the sale of self improvement might not be an enticing offer to everyone.
Of course. And then when it comes to relationships too, I'm sure technology has drastically changed not just like romantic relationships, but even friendships and people with on the internet. Um, do you think there's a reduction in quality of these relationships, or there's, I guess, like one thing we see when it comes to social media is the idea that reputable journalists can now be held on the same level as anonymous, faceless websites and bloggers. Like the standards have all been lowered, but everything is more equal in a way. Do you think relationships have undergone this route too, where now everybody can be your friend, everyone can follow you, but none of those individual friends are actually your friends? You don't feel anything out of that.
Yeah, I think you are limited in the depth of a relationship you're going to manage online, by and large. I just think there's too many things going on at the same time in a personal presence compared to a online presence for that. I think it's a decent way to keep in contact with people, a decent way to kind of help a relationship get through long absences from one another, but I don't necessarily think it's a very good long-term solution, right? So it's a good way to build some shared experience from time to time to catch up that way or to do something, right? Like this idea of changing in the same way within a relationship is kind of part of how you get that longevity, right? You need to have those common points of shared either experience or interest and then update those from time to time to time. So I think online persona allows that to some degree. You know, if you're watching your friend's feed, you get some sense of what their life is. Now it's unfortunately a transformed element of their life. It's not an accurate portrayal of their life, but it's something, you know, to have a friend comment on a thing or to, you know, reach out via Zoom and catch up for an hour or something like this, or a virtual happy hour or something like this. These are all reasonable things to do, especially when your other options are limited, be it, you know, geography or be it COVID or something like that. But I don't think it really, at least for me, doesn't replace the in-person element of things. It's not rich enough as an information thing yet. I don't feel as connected to someone online as I do in person when I'm having a conversation with them.
Yeah, I would have to agree with you there, although I don't know if I can fully justify it. Like, what about being in person makes it more meaningful? Maybe it is just the physicality of it. But when it comes to, uh, I guess, friendships or just talking to people online, you could be two disembodied voices talking in a void. Is there anything in the visual simulation that makes that relationship better? I can
Yeah.
say this not having a camera, but I'll definitely get that one up soon.
I mean, absolutely. There's so much information lost when I can't see the face of the person I'm talking to. And there is the delay in online conversation over something like Zoom, where the reaction a person has isn't in reaction to what you've said. It's in reaction to something you've said like a second ago or something like this, is really, really noticeable, at least for me when I'm communicating with people. I always feel off with people on Zoom, and it's often just that little bit of delay in between the things I've said and the impact they're showing, or vice versa, right? It always feels just a little bit off to me. So I do think I mean, the visual is part of it, the body language part of it, just the expression of things you do is part of it. You know, like the physicality of moving is relevant. I don't know. I would say there's a combination of things that aren't there yet. And even something like the weight of a person's, like physical weight of a person's presence. I mean, like, I don't know about for you, this is getting really anecdotal. I don't know if I have research for this, but like if I'm in a room with someone, like I have a sense of the physicality of that person. You know, like maybe a good example of this would be like you're in the room with like my brother's 6'5" and is a pretty big guy, right? And he made a comment once that like no one would talk to him in person the same way that people on the online talk to him, because in the moment of being in his presence physically, even if they're not consciously thinking about it or acknowledging it, that's a 6'5", 240-pound guy over there, right? That changes the feeling of that interaction. It's one thing if you're posting, you're shit posting on Twitter, and it would be an entirely different scenario if you're both sitting in a bar and you have a disagreement with someone like that. You're going to be more polite. The conversation's going to go down differently. You're going to be aware of that because there's an impact of that. And it's not like my brother's a violent guy or something like this, but it's just hardwired into you that you're going to feel that presence in some different degree. And not always in that negative sense, right? Maybe that's a preventative thing to some degree with like a disagreement or something like that. But there's also that element of physicality that is there even with someone who you're just friendly with, right? Like a friend or something, you're aware of them as a physical being as well, which I think gets dropped from Zoom or online interactions.
And I mean, just based off that, it triggers the thought in my head that most of the root cause of all the toxicity on social media and the polarization is just to the idea that we can simplify everyone to a symbolic head or talking head, and there is no persona behind it. We're able to, in some, I don't know if it's some sort of utilitarian viewing of it, but just see them as an other opposing view and be able to get away with things against them that we wouldn't do in person if they were saying the same things to us.
I think it's got to be, we have to acknowledge the audience there, right? I would feel like, and maybe a Zoom call isn't a good example of this, but certainly if we're doing Twitter or Facebook or something like this, it really is. If I'm having a conversation in a bar with someone I disagree with, not only do I have a much more rich information source about them and have to deal with things like their physicality, but I also have no audience. There's no one I'm showing off to, or I'm not dunking on this person in front of someone. I've got a real individual right there who's probably a flawed individual in the same way I'm a flawed individual, probably is not a particularly bad person overall, has some disagreements, and we're going to talk about these things to some degree. And the minute I'm online and it's in front of, it's in front of an audience, or it's in front of my, it changes the feeling of that, and probably changes the goals really of the people engaging with that to some degree. Virtue signaling is a really good example of this. I don't think you're going to find that happen to the degree it does in a kind of one-on-one conversation offline somewhere, as it does when everyone in your social circle is following you and reads the words that you're putting out, that you get trapped in the kind of this maintenance of an identity to from my perspective. So
yeah, so one of my background in running these events and being a community organizer for fighting games, we have to manage bans from people too. And to be vague with the details on one ban, there was this young person who, for one reason or another, was doing a lot of Nazi imagery and transphobia stuff and a lot of troll accounts messing with people, and he was banned. And in talking to him in person, one-on-one, it was so clear he was very aware of how many anger issues he had. He didn't want to live this life where he was lashing out. And every time he did this, he would try to apologize, try to reintegrate to the community. But of course, once in a while, it leaks back out. And I don't know, in talking to him, it seems like there's no way to reach through to these people once you've ruined your reputation, partially because your online identity that you're maintaining your whole life, that has now become your identity.
I'm sorry, no way to reach through to these people being the people that he had antagonized or in their friend group, or no way to reach through to this guy? I wasn't clear on that. I think
no way to shift the narrative or give his own side of a story. I'm not defending what he did by any means, but the idea that like our online personas that we maintain have now become more real and more tangible in this virtual space than our physical selves. So I guess to wrap this back around to what you were saying, having the one-on-one with him opened my eyes that he wasn't a shitty person. He isn't just what I read on Twitter, but I'm also not sure how to get through to him if he's actually willing to change and if he can reintegrate in a community.
Yeah, I think it's humanizing is what it is when you actually get to talk to someone, as opposed to dealing with just like kind of the front they put forth. I found this, kind of as a silly example, I found this when I played Civ multiplayer, that it was much easier to maintain animosity or anger at an unknown person, like my opponent in the game, than it was if they were on voice comms with me, to the point that sometimes I would leave voice comms because I wanted the focus that I got from the annoyance or the anger at that other player in that. But if they were on comms, it humanized them too much for me to maintain that. So yeah, for sure. When you get to know people, you're a little bit more accepting of them as a flawed totality than you are on the Twitter war for that, for sure.
So, and then, I mean, when it comes to this person's case, not to harp on it, does it have to come down to one? You seem to say that it all comes down to wanting personal change And then two, somehow humbling yourself or letting down your guard on the ego. Maybe it's because it's fighting games or just the gaming world in general, but everyone is very competitive, has this persona, has this front they have to maintain of being strong, being tough, not losing. I think it's easy for us, maybe when you get older in life or when you have some self-reflection, to be more comfortable with losing. But I guess, how do you become comfortable with the idea that you have to compromise this persona for other people, that you can't maintain the front that you want all the time? Like, do you feel any pressure as a streamer to be this, great gamer, always winning all the time, or do you see it as a more, I'm showing them a human side of me when I'm playing? You try to be more real.
A lot of questions there. Let's see if I can
Sorry,
break them
break
apart.
it.
On the one hand, I think goals is the first answer. The first answer of what do you do about maintaining this? That there might not be a very useful goal of humanizing yourself in a fighting game tournament, for example. You may actually wish to reinforce that the persona that you're presenting, because it gives you advantage in the tournament itself. It gives you a shield of losses or wins, or a shield from trash talk, etc. Right? Like, so I'm not sure that you always are going to do this. Maintaining personas is useful in all sorts of different ways in your life, right? You act very differently around your boss than you do around your subordinate or your wife compared to your professional area, right? So maintaining personas isn't, I don't think, inherently bad, and I think it has utility for that. So if you're asking in general, like, for example, when you're talking a gaming tournament, I don't think there's a lot of reason to relax that necessarily. If you're talking broader, so when you talk like with my community, for example, so I started as a competitive gamer in a, I don't know if you can call Civ 5 competitive gaming. I mean, it's multiplayer gaming, right? So there's certainly that element of expertise in a teaching channel on a highly competitive multiplayer game kind of deal. So for me, walking away from that, yeah, there's elements of it. You're humbled all the time, but I've now played so much. I mean, I play a variety streamer these days, so I learn games all the time on channel in front of people, and you kind of get used to allowing people to see you screw up, and that's kind of all right, at least from my perspective.
Just
I
putting
think,
yourself out there makes it more comfortable for you.
yeah, and it's funny the way you described ego almost again still doesn't really resonate with me. I can't remember the exact words you were saying with that, but you're almost like,
I guess ego, maybe that's not the right term, but in the sense of, I am this big tough guy competitor. I am the best. I'm not going to not only lose in the tournament, but lose in an argument, compromise my thoughts, my ideals.
yeah, okay. I guess multiple thoughts on that. One, which is that, at least for me, they talk about some stuff in psychology looking at mental health and looking at essentially the importance of the domain really matters to you, or really matters for that. So I think the example is looking at it isn't particularly ego threatening if I don't know how to I don't know, change the engine in my car or something. Like if I have to remove an engine from my car and put it back in or something, right? I don't have a lot of ego tied up in that. But if you're talking about some sort of, like, let's say it was a Civ 5 concept or something, right? When it's like, he really ought to know this kind of deal. I have a lot more ego involved with that because it's a domain that's more core to the things that I care about, that how I think about myself, right? So it's these ideas of so I don't know that it matters in all of these things. I don't have a lot of ego these days wrapped up in being the best at a game. That's just not particularly high in how I see my self-worth and self-confidence, right? So
Was there a moment? Oh, sorry, go ahead.
no, ask your question.
Was there a moment that changed that for you? Because being very competitive seems natural, especially it was for me at one point. But eventually, I either got burnt out or I realized that being the best at everything is not the way to go through life, at least for the life I wanted to live. Was there experience you had that triggered that for you?
Yeah, in a lot of different ways. Some of it was, well, like, who are the positive, particularly male influences in my life? Who are the people that I really felt like I was gaining a lot of self-knowledge from, and who were enhancing the quality of my life and the thinking about my own life, are often very humble individuals. In other words, they were confident, able to present their ideas, but could field questions. They weren't fragile about it. They were able to be challenged, able to have discussions about these things. We're working to make this not a persona for that. So that for me is very helpful for, especially when I'm learning things, is from where there's no budding of ego there, right? I'm not feeling like they're shitting on me because they're teaching me something. I'm not feeling like, I don't feel like they're challenging in the sense of challenging who I am. They might be challenging my ideas, but it's not a personal thing. It's not a personal attack, and I don't have to be listening to some stuck-up asshole tell me how life is kind of deal, right? So that helps a little bit there for me. If you're asking in general, how did I get there? I don't know that I started anywhere. It's not that I didn't start anywhere else. It's that, again, I think this is just reflection on things I've learned as I've gotten older about myself, right? Which is, I know I have an ego, and I can, over time, watch patterns of interaction in my life and be like, hey, the outcomes from this versus the outcomes from that, which of these do I want more of in my life? There's certainly areas where ego is absolutely appropriate, right? Like where you're gonna, and again, I think that tournament's a good one perhaps, but like perhaps something I deal with on a regular basis is like trolls in my channel, right? Like I'm happy to have my ego take a shot at them in that moment and have fun with that. I'm fine with that. It's not inherently bad that is one of the responses I have in my repertoire. But it's really bad if that's blocking things I care about in like my relationship with my wife, where where it's a very important relationship to me, and I want it to be as positive as it can be for both of us, and I want to actively suppress things that are going to compromise that. For example, hiding behind ego there. So in those scenarios, like, yeah, you're going to be more vulnerable there, and yeah, you might have to admit that you fucked up here, you don't really know there kind of deal, but the outcomes are really important to me there and matter how I engage with that. So
okay.
I don't think ego is bad. Like that's not the mentality on that. It's that not understanding my own ego in those moments has been detrimental to portions of my life, and working with that has led me to outcomes that I want more often, which is a pretty damn good reason to change a behavior from my perspective.
Yeah, and it seems like it helps a lot too that your mentality, your self-worth is not tied to follower count or anything like that. You stream what you want, you've always has been, and you've switched to variety streaming because you enjoy doing that.
That's a hard one
But
mentally to work with, the viewer count stuff like that. So one of the so two thoughts on that. That's always a work in progress. That's not perfect. I definitely get worried about low view count, and it definitely does matter to me to some degree. It's view count is in particular basically a stand-in for everything in streaming. It's a stand-in for the value of your channel, essentially, is your viewer count for that. And that's not a personal reflection, that's just a financial reflection. Sponsorships, interest from et cetera, right? Your influence is essentially your view count. That's a very good stand-in metric for that. So that doesn't not affect me, but it has to be secondary to my goals. Yeah, would I love to be a better channel? Absolutely, but opportunity cost. Would I love to be a massive channel? Sure, but opportunity cost, right? So if I could find a way to keep the things that I care about in my life as they are and expand my channel size, yeah, that would be great. I would happily step into that. But part of those things that are core to me are, I want time with my family. That's important to me. I want to do the things that I'm engaged with. And that's important to me both because it keeps me sane, but it also impacts the quality of the presentation I put forth. And I want the freedom to do what I want on my channel. That's important to me as well. I want to be, I left my academic career to do this full time because potentially it could be a more rewarding life experience for me, potentially. But that isn't true. That's compromised if I'm doing stuff like only chasing the top game of the year that's just come out, or I'm grinding 24 hours on some fucking game that I don't give a shit about because it's the popular thing to do right now, or I'm stuck playing a game that I enjoyed and burnt out on, and I'm playing that for the next 10 years of my life. Those it's the opportunity cost of that, right? Like I could probably grow my channel more aggressively doing something like that, but I don't think it long term would work for me.
is that something that you've come to realize over time again, or was there something that triggered that for you? And I say this seeing, I guess I really wonder how questionable it is that Twitch gamifies the experience of becoming a streamer, getting into it, and gamifies these metrics, leading back to the idea of social media before. So is this something where you've you now have a more healthier relationship with your followers and your size, or I don't know. What are your experiences?
I found the act of stepping away. So everyone streaming starts somewhere, and I started with Civ 5, and I played that probably for 2 years on stream, maybe a little bit longer. And when I left streaming Civ 5, I was, I had stayed longer than I would have if I was on my own. And that in of itself isn't a problem because I often play games longer than I would for the stream, in part because I like the experience of learning back from my chat as well and having these things be a community experience as opposed to an individual experience. It's really kind of opened my eyes on a lot of games I would never have touched otherwise. But in part at that point, it was because I didn't know what the hell I was going to do if I stopped streaming Civ 5. You know, it was going to be, I had known from just in general streaming, but also from some smaller test streams that when I changed games, I lost viewership. I also had a lot of community pushback from that. You know, when I was playing games that weren't Civ 5, when are you going to play Civ 5? How come you're not playing Civ 5? When are you going to go back to Civ 5? Is this going to be a Civ 5 stream later? This type of stuff, right? You get a lot of that, especially from the viewers who have been only known you for that. But it wasn't sustainable. I heard, I don't remember who said this, but I think it might have been a Summit and somebody else podcast. Can't remember who you had on for that when they were talking about this, but they're talking about the fact that a game has a viewership life cycle that essentially is finite. So you're going to hit some peak on that game. And if you're streaming that game at that moment, you are streaming to the absolute peak number of people who will be interested in that game, probably ever again, although some of these games do like cycles of their interest. So, but if you think about that, that means that your career as a streamer then becomes tied to the rise and fall of that game. And maybe you can manage to be a serial monogamist where you stick with one game until you basically ridden that into the dirt, and then you come out of the ashes with another game, which is then you do the same thing again, like staying on that forever and ever until the next game shows up that you can move to, kind of deal. And maybe your community survives that way, although you still run all the same issues when you transition from one game to the next. But I don't want my success or ability to stream to be tied to any single game. And my gaming interests don't tend to be super mainstream. I don't like first-person shooters, for example. I mostly prefer kind of niche strategy games where the viewership on these is never particularly huge anyway. So did I learn from that? Yeah. I mean, I kind of stumbled into the fact that I was burning out on this game. My community only wanted more content from that game, and I was starting to dislike streaming that game, despite the fact that I had chosen to be streaming over another career that I could be doing. So once I kind of had that in perspective of, well, I'm making myself fucking miserable doing this, I realized, well, that's not sustainable. I'm not going to keep doing this. So I either need to go find a different career, do something different entirely, or I need to figure out a way to adapt the career that I'm doing to a way that works for me.
Yeah, the word that resonated there was just pacing or sustainability. Like if you're not able to maintain this physically and mentally, then whatever that game is, it's not the right game for you. So, I mean, if you had not enjoyed gaming, would you have left being a streamer, or would you find a new career path?
I'm sorry, do you mean would I have left graduate school?
Just even like now, if you found games that, or you stopped finding games that entertained you enough to stream them anymore, would you pick up and go and find a new lifestyle that made you more happy?
Yeah, so part of streaming for me has been the realization that streaming is often a series of like waves, kind of, right? There's ups and downs in it. So I might be on the top of the world when I have some game that I'm super excited about that I want to stream, that I want to play 20 hours a day, and I like stream for like 10 hours a day, and I'm doing extra streams and bonus streams for this, and we're, you know, really engaging with the content. It's a super good game, but those tend to be pretty finite experiences for me. Like I will hit a wall with games, and then I want to be done with those games. And it's great when I have other games to fall back on, but I often either have games that aren't great, or we're still looking for a game, or we're checking out a bunch of games, kind of deal. So there's these like big, long, rolling waves of the highs and lows of streaming. And part of my adapting to doing this is realizing that the lows are temporary, and that as long as I see general progress long term, I can live with lows and highs in that. So
I like that. Yeah, look for the high points, not the low points.
Well, but more, see, that's not like I appreciate the compliment that you like that mentality, but I actually think with your restatement of that loses something from that, because when you're in that high point, it's really easy to be like, I'm on the fucking top of the world, right? But it's actually the low point where it's the point that becomes the valuable time to have that knowledge. because you don't need the reinforcement of that when you're on the high point of that. You're experiencing that. You're loving the game. Your chats, your community's coming back to you. You have large numbers of viewers in your channel. You're making money doing this. All these things are already high. It's in the opposite side of that when you're at the low end of your viewership and you're struggling to figure out what the fuck you're logging in for each day and wondering, is this the right decision? That then it's worth having the perspective of these things are much more cyclic than it appears now. But just because this moment is a down moment doesn't mean this experience of streaming is a down thing for my life.
Yeah, I guess you made a good distinction there, that it's easy to focus on the positive, but at least for some people, looking back, the negative or stronger emotions are the ones that will stand out and change us the most. Like I can think of past arguments I've had that have made me feel bad in the moment, but later on, I was able to incorporate things I've learned from that conversation into my life and drop my guard down and synthesize what they were saying properly. So in the
But
same way, oh, go ahead.
no, please finish your thought. I didn't mean to cut you off.
Oh, just the idea that streaming yes, streaming is a long-term goal. You should be looking at the low points and seeing how those increase rather than the top. I think it's a more realistic, pessimistic view of life. Maybe not the most popular view that people go for, but I think it's an important one.
And also that every moment to moment in your life doesn't have to be good for the overall to be good, right? I can hate that moment when I'm sitting there wondering what fucking game I'm going to play, feeling super unmotivated about this and struggling with the fact that like, well, it's work. I need to go do work and show up for this, and that I'm miserable in that moment. And that becomes a problem only if A, this becomes too prevalent, like happening too often, or B, I can't understand that this is only a small portion of my engagement with that, right? So if every day is like that and every month is like that, that's a problem. If some days are like that, that's really not a problem in the gender thing. I like my life. I like my career and I like my profession. So can I have some of these low points be there? Sure, I absolutely can. And I'd like to minimize their impact of that, but it's still okay to have low points. Anyone who's pushing for a life where there's no low points isn't really, from my perspective, isn't really looking for isn't accurately approaching how life is going to be. There's going to be low points always in things, right? So if every low point is seen as this insurmountable problem or this reason that everything has to be thrown out, that doesn't seem accurate. That doesn't seem a realistic approach to life for me.
Do you find low points to be the most motivating? Like you said early on about how it gets you to, I guess, work on projects or start new endeavors. Is it the low points that trigger those changes?
Yeah, they talk about people being motivated. There's some study, I can't remember, again, it's been a while since I won't have the research on hand, but it was essentially looking at whether or not people perform to be not failing or perform to be like the top of a set of people kind of deal. And for me, the motivation tends to be the former, which is I tend to be motivated by those things of I don't want to be last here. I don't want to fail here. I don't want to be, less so than I have to be the best streamer. I don't want to fail out of streaming kind of deal is a much more motivating force for me. So what has that been in life? That has been, yeah, those moments are useful. Those moments are often, for me, moments that have signified great change in my life, right? Like when I made the decision to go to graduate school, was because I was sitting there going, hey, life right now really sucks. And the pattern of life has overall been much lower quality than I was wanting for my life. And I need to make a change from this because this sucks now and has sucked reliably for some extended period of time before that. So yeah, that is a useful moment for creating change. It's also a useful moment for allowing yourself to enjoy your life just in general, which is if you understand that there's ups and downs and understand that a down is often a finite period of time, as long as I see that trajectory as a whole being positive, that generally lets me get through that fairly well, which is I can see that there's reason to expect light at the end of the tunnel, even if I can't see it right now.
I just noticed our time is over. I'm sorry if you had to go. I was enjoying the conversation. Do you have to step off?
I actually wasn't sure how long this would go, so I blocked 2 hours for it. So I'm
okay. I can keep
I'm
talking
good
for a little bit more.
Yeah, for sure.
I guess piggybacking on that, then it's not for me, but for people in my life when they are at this low point and it is hard for them to then get the willpower motivation to get themselves out of the rut. I know we didn't want to speak to depression, but just, I guess, yeah, the the mentality of using a negative, strong emotion to motivate yourself may work for someone like you or me, but there's definitely people where that is the opposite effect, and you need the sort of carrot motivation rather than a stick or something more negative, you know?
Sure.
So I guess one question I have for you is, do you know of any behavioral or social things in your relationships that you can do to help motivate people to grow on their own without having to beat them down and be negative?
Well, I suppose one of the things that was motivational for me, again, for my graduate school stuff, was seeing people in happy relationships and seeing them do things that were totally different from what I understood a relationship to be. So I guess part of it to me seems to be, well, shit, if I'm feeling down and I look around and someone I know or I'm close to seems to be doing really well in life, it seems like to me there's something that's worth discussing with that person. Now, that isn't always going to work for everyone again. So when we look at this, my first answer to be, what are you going to do about depression, is go talk to a clinical psychologist about this, right?
Of course,
Talk
yeah.
to the people who have the training for that. So when I reinterpret your question, I kind of look at this anecdotally, and I hear the question being essentially, well, you've suggested some things that work for you with low points as motivation. If you were looking at other sources of motivation for you when you're dealing with depression or dealing with being down, what would they be? Is that a fair recharacterization of your question?
Yeah, or is there anything from your time in research with relationships? What are positive reinforcement loops that help get people out of that state? If a negative one, like a, you know,
Sure.
that won't work.
I again would look for role models in your life who seem to be attaining or accomplishing things that you find valuable, and spending some time communicating with them. I think your romantic partner is super useful for that as well. At least in my relationships, like having that as a support network is really good. I think understanding that you don't always have to be perfect is really helpful for that as well. You can have off days, you can have off months, you can have off weeks, whatever it happens to be. You can take a cheat day if you need to, or whatever the hell that happens to be. To I don't. I guess I'm a little older than the generations. I'm 36, by the way. I think that came up a little bit earlier, and I don't think I got a chance to answer you with that. But I do think there are things you can't like skirk, that sometimes you have to do things that you don't want to do, even though it sucks. But it's also okay to be in a position where you're like, look, I can afford to take this day off work if I need to, and I really need to do this in this moment. I need to take this break. I need to get this distance from this problem, or this distance from the repetitive stressor, or whatever it happens to be. I need to treat myself for a little bit here, or I just need that time to myself. And I've seen that both ways. I've seen people who do this to the point where they never get anything accomplished, but I've also seen people who hold themselves to such a high standard that they aren't able to allow that to be. And for me, that's really important. Like, if I'm feeling shitty about something and struggling with it, it's not always the best idea to keep powering through it. I was kind of raised in a family where it's like, if you're not accomplishing something, the inevitable problem is you're not putting enough effort into it. And I haven't actually found that to ring true in my life. Oftentimes there's places where effort helps, but there's also times where no amount of effort in that moment is going to be useful. And I need to step back, reevaluate, come at it from a different way, or shore up my resources in a different way than just forcing more down that route. So again, support networks seem super big to me. And then finding that thing that you're wanting from it and asking people who have obtained that how to get that has been useful for me as well.
And then, of course, it all comes down to, you need to want individual change on your level. Otherwise, all this is a pretty moot point, right?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Well, I mean, you could probably force some of this down people's throat. I'm sure that that's a possibility, but it doesn't seem like a realistic alternative to me. Like, you're never going to find people who aren't interested in, like, there's just aren't people who are engaged by conversation like this, for example. So it's no good trying to lead them with that conversation. You look at like some of the learning literature, right? There's some things that work fairly well in general, but there's also there's individual differences in how people best learn. So I expect it's going to be something similar here, right? There's going to be individual differences to how people engage with this in a way that's useful to them.
Yeah, and it makes sense that having role models, just being a good example to the people around you, would be one of the most core ways to just be someone in their life, to show that you don't have to be perfect, to show that there are other ways of dealing with your problems. Another concern that comes up here for me is, I guess, the idea of people who don't want to go see therapists or are too strong, like you said, to ask for help. Um, is this a case where they're too stubborn and they're not open to help and we can't do anything for them? or is the only thing we can do just set more examples, have more role models, show them that they can act a different way?
I don't think you can force someone to do something that they don't want like that. Not when it comes to like mental health, right? Like ultimately, if I am set on the idea that I wish to end my own life, I, you can push as hard as you want on some level, but I have that right to some degree as well. So I think it's a fine line there, right? The fine line of you as a outsider to someone's stuff, trying to be supportive or offer things that can be helpful or trying to point them towards resources that were useful to them, combined with then how they take that. And I understand that your cognition is so state dependent, right? So I understand that in the moment of lost in that moment of depression or lost in that period of depression, it can be very difficult to see the benefits of doing something. It can be very difficult to motivate to do these things, especially if it takes some effort for that. But on the one hand, you also have to respect people's ability to choose for themselves. So I don't know. I don't think there's a perfect answer for that, right? The closer you are to someone, presumably, the more you know about them and the more you understand the routes that reach them. So definitely you can what's the word I'm looking for? You can change your information to match the target a little bit better, but you can't force someone to fix something about their life if they don't want to. And I don't think you should be able to do that, quite honestly.
So then when it comes to the case of someone who doesn't want to get therapy or refuses to try psychiatric medicine when it may genuinely help them, is this truly like a lost cause? It's just not a responsibility, like it's all up to them?
Well, those things seem, part of that's reasoning. So why? Why does someone not want to see this psychologist, for example? Is it finances? Is it because they don't believe that that is a working solution? Is it because they are to a point where they feel that getting any help is admitting a weakness kind of deal? You can attack the reason that supports their decision, even if you can't attack the decision directly, right?
Mm.
So, if for example someone says something like, well, that doesn't work, it's just a bunch of bullshit. Well, there's a fuck ton of information talking about the efficacy of some of these interventions, right? So you can, if you have a person who engages with that, you can present that. And it doesn't have to be you send them a citation for this or something. It depends the type of person are. You can have a conversation about that. Be like, look, if someone, in the same with the other prerequisites for that, right? If you have someone who says like, this is admitting defeat, you can talk about the normalcy of this, for example, right? Like essentially, especially for depression, you look at it this way. If you have a fucking problem with your car, you go to a mechanic. If you're suffering some bizarre rash, you go to a fucking doctor. If your mind is suddenly working massively differently than you're used to, and it's doing so in a way that is problematic to your life, why wouldn't you go seek out the people with the tools to at least give you some understanding and insight of what that is, from my perspective? But again, that's just attacking the person's reluctance to use that tool, rather than telling them they have to use such a tool.
Yeah, and this is basically my motivation and why I respect the idea of having everyone take a psychology class early in their life. I think that helps you understand your internal motivations and self-examine. Usually people just talk about logic and reason, and these are all great, but if you don't like I said before, you can find facts to fit any narrative in your head. It's too easy to find things like, I can't get too specific on some of these cases, but there are ways to find other remedies that people tout as working, but they don't actually work. And due to placebo effect, due to personal choice, it's very hard to get these people to then go to therapy or take proper medication, things that would actually improve their life. So I guess, yeah, it all comes down to how we interact with this information. If we trust sources from outside of our sphere or people closer to us, and then I guess what type of information is best to show them that's not confrontational, doesn't shatter their worldview or anything, but maybe introduces a new concept to them.
Yeah. Yep. And again, this has never been something that I wanted to do professionally for this, because I think there is it's a lot of mental work, a lot of emotional work to be taking on other people's problems. But the people doing this have a lot of positive change in other people's lives, right? So I have a very close friend who, before he retired, spent his career doing counseling, and he tells a lot of stories about a lot of different people who have had better outcomes in their lives because of this. And that's a pretty good thing to be hearing from professionals in this, that, you know, they can make a difference with the people who approach them and want that change. So yeah, I don't know, not something I personally wish to be doing, but certainly there are resources out there for people dealing with this.
Yeah, it's not something I want to do. I think it takes a very special person to take on that emotional burden. Also, not to get your own life mixed up in it, but ultimately, you can only control your own emotions, what you understand about yourself. So that's why I think people should read psychology.
You can control your own emotions. I can't control my own emotions.
Well, okay, not control your own emotions, but understand where they're coming from at some basal level.
Yeah.
I guess
I feel like I feel like I play a strategy game in my own head, and it's often keeping 1 to 2 steps ahead of how I will emotionally respond to something, because the outcomes, I don't think I'm going to train the flare of anger at a situation or the flare of annoyance at a situation. I'm not going to train that out of myself. It's much easier to train myself to recognize the type of situation that often triggers that for me, and understand that this flare is likely to pop up here. How do I wish to approach that? Like, that's the more useful self-knowledge for me long term. Like, I always am very dubious of people suggesting methods that are changing who people inherently are. I feel like I haven't changed who I am inherently. I'm just better at doing things that highlight my strengths and reduce my weaknesses display, right? Like, you know, so if I know I'm going to be annoyed with my wife talking to me in this time, rather than cause a fight, like yelling at my wife for something that's not a problem, I can be like, look, can we talk about this tomorrow, or can we touch back on this, you know, when I'm in a better mood about this thing, when I haven't had a shitty day or something like that. That's a hack, right? I didn't change the fact that I flared up in that. I'm just at this point experienced enough to know that this is not a good time to be doing this for me. I'm end up with outcomes I don't want.
And that took a lot of self-reflection, but also it's your area of expertise, and both you and your wife are interested in this, so I'm sure that helped.
Yeah, absolutely. It sure does, for sure. But you run into the issue at some point, like that's almost what am I looking at? Tautological? Is that how I say that? I can't remember the word.
Maybe, yeah.
Where like it begs the question a little bit here, right? Because you're asking essentially, how do you reach someone who doesn't want to be reached? Well, shit, you know, like, yes, it's certainly better to be working with the people who do wish to be reached.
So then also, I guess, were there any tenets of evolutionary psychology that really painted your way of thinking about the world? Or any studies in particular? I don't want to take the topic first. I think I'm more interested in what you have to say here.
From Evo or from my own research? I'm sorry, I didn't hear.
Just Evo.
Evo as a whole was almost entirely fascinating, almost wherever I looked. There's a lot of issues with the research from that and the conclusions that can be drawn from this. I think this came up recently on a PKA episode from my conversation with this. But so you can run into the issue of just so stories kind of deal. But if you can take the perspective of looking at, well, what are these, if you can take this as just an information source and then worry about the kind of the purity of that information source, or the implications of that information source, and keep those a little bit separate as you're doing it, it becomes extremely interesting, because it's essentially looking at why we are as we are on a long-term biological sense. And it doesn't really matter your own subjective experience. You don't have an inherent good sense of who you are as a biological being by and large. You don't understand where these urges come from, why things are as they are, and whether or not you can question that or rebuild that in a way that's more useful to you, or even what more useful to you would look like. So it just was a fucking mind-opening class in general. And I have no specific piece of research that immediately sticks out. If I had to really think about it, I might look at some of the differences, sex differences, for example, were very interesting research. There's a lot of kind of contention of how deep these sex differences are and what they're caused by, if they really are like biological sex differences, or if these are societal differences. But the idea of these kind of fundamental drivers of human psychology were really, really interesting to me.
Yeah, one of your studies that was interesting, I don't remember the title off the top of my head, but to paraphrase it, it was just that there may be an evolutionary basis for desensitizing our disgust mechanisms to make us engage in more risky sexual behavior to propagate more easily.
That's a fair phrasing. There's no question that disgust and sexual arousal are essentially opposites for this. Sexual disgust and sexual arousal. I don't think there's any question of that. That's not the type of things that would be questionable for that. But yeah, the one you're talking about is that's my dissertation, or not dissertation, my thesis rather, my master's thesis was looking at that. We manipulated disgust and then measured sexual arousal. So, or very similar to that. So looking at those. So essentially, they're basically exactly opposite. We manipulated sexual arousal. As you manipulate sexual arousal, sexual disgust reporting goes down. So people find things in the sexual domain less disgusting than they do when their sexual arousal is down, controlling for everything else, essentially, which is...
So is this something that can generalize outside of just the sexual field to, again, how we interact with information or outside people? Like, we're always going to be more receptive to someone who is, I guess, on our side, or, you know, stoking positive emotions, stimulation, whatever you would call that in that sense, than negative.
This one in particular is really domain specific. So the what we did with this for this one is I looked at, there's essentially a scale that looks at sexual disgust, and then we threw in two other scales looking at like pathogen disgust, and there's I can't remember the third one at this point, but essentially other domains of disgust. And what we actually found was a significant reduction in sexual disgust, but either a much smaller or a non-significant reduction in other disgust. So no, you couldn't. I don't think you could generalize that as a whole, because it's more of a specific mechanism than that.
Got it. I see.
Yeah.
When it comes to evolutionary psych, I think I mostly touched on what was most interesting to me was just how we interact with technology, how we are totally under evolved for how we're dealing with it now, and again, how we're designing it to impair us in the long term in many ways.
Yeah, well, even worse than that, right? Because not only are we wholly unprepared for it, the people designing the systems are tapping into those motivations, right? So they're designing a system that reaches you on some of your most fundamental levels. And then your advice to deal with it is essentially willpower through it. Not yours personally, but I mean general societal advice is just, well, just don't give into your temptation. Like, that is enough of a reasonable thing to combat that. You've given someone all the advanced tools to hack into you, and then given yourself none of the advanced defenses to deal with that. That's a mismatched fight for sure.
Oh, it's mind-blowing to me. And like the Skinner box analogy is so good. Just having this thing in your pocket in the case of a phone, and having one button or a red notification icon be able to give you dopamine and serotonin on demand. I don't see how anyone could like, well, here's a question for you. I don't know if you plan on having kids, but like, at what age do you think we could even introduce this to someone without a risk of it, you know, overtaking their life? Because I don't even know what I would say if I had kids at this point.
Yeah, it's an interesting conversation. We don't intend to have children in our relationship, and I suppose that's possible that it changes, but there's that question of your responsibility as a parent then, of how you introduce that. I don't know. I suspect that I would look for research for that to see, you know, like my wife teaches higher education, so I'm sure I would just talk to people in her department essentially to be like, hey, so what are you guys recommending these days for that? But it seems to essentially be the longer and the sooner it's introduced, the more damage it does. So I suppose that's going to be, you know, the inevitable fight between parent and child of what they want and what's good for them. So I don't know.
And then also compulsory again, because the pandemic, we're forcing everyone online. We have to do remote learning now. You're more likely to turn to social media if you're emotional and, you know, psychological needs. So I don't know. It's a very complicated discussion.
Yeah. Yep. It is a very real problem right now, in my opinion, that we're going to have to deal with. Forgetting even the productivity of it, it's by and large, people's personal happiness seems to be very heavily wrapped up in this, and then communication as a whole right now through those mediums is so fucking toxic and so bad. It isn't helpful to create people with different definitions of facts and then try to let them loose in a society and tell them to live together. It does not seem like a long-term goal that we want to reach, because we're gonna build a society that can't talk to itself, and that's fucking so disastrous.
Yeah, and we're already on the way there, like you said. I forget who said it the other day. Maybe it was Destiny, but one of the streams they said most of the liberal audience is Twitch, most of the centrist audience is YouTube, and most of the conservative audience is Facebook streaming, and that's just how it is at this point. it feels like we've already like gotten past the point where these things they're starting to separate out and become their own entities, their own filter bubbles.
Yeah, yeah, and can't have that. That's just not going to work long term, is it? So
Do you see yourself expanding off Twitch at any point?
maybe. Twitch contracts are exclusive, so as long as I'm a partner with Twitch, I'm exclusive to Twitch for what they consider competitive content, which is essentially gaming content. So I could probably do like a podcast or something if I wanted to on like YouTube live stream or Facebook live stream if I wanted to, since it's not competitive with the content I create here, for example. But to answer that question more broadly, I don't know. I suspect that to do this for any length of time, certainly to do it up till now, has required a fair number of adaptations to both the technology and the atmosphere around it. And I suspect that will be a mandatory component of this going forth. So I don't know where it will end up. I don't know that. I mean, Twitch has only been around for what, like 5, 7? I don't know how many years now. You know, like I don't either. But the point being that it's been a relatively recent thing, and these other platforms are just starting out. So I don't know where I'll end up.
Your chat's excited for the YouTube podcast. We'll see.
Yeah, yeah. I don't know. Podcast would be fun, but I think it would be a lot of work to keep it fresh, I think.
Well, yeah, that's part of the benefit of what I'm doing here. I have the luxury of not having to stream and fill content every day. Once a week or every 2 weeks when I feel like it, I can talk to someone interesting and learn from them. So I definitely thank you for coming on and talk to me now. I've run out of basic topics to cover, but is there anything else you wanted to branch into?
Well, I guess it depends. Let me just take a quick peek at what you sent me initially and see if we kind of covered that as I see it for this. Psychology of learning from your own experiences versus learning from others. I think we covered a fair amount of that. Other thoughts on that? Just trying to work through this. I think there's some individuality to this. I think we kind of had this theme in there as I refuse to answer your questions directly because I keep reverting to this point, which is I think different people learn and engage differently. So giving general broad stroke advice is really difficult in a scenario like this.
Yeah.
So, and maybe we can clean up the ego stuff for this, since we've kind of stumbled around it a couple times, and I wouldn't mind just taking a crack at that again, which is...
Sure. Explain it to me as you understand it, because I'm definitely using it incorrectly.
Yeah, I don't know if I wasn't trying to directly say that you'd done something with this. I just think I don't think I presented a particularly clear point on this. And the clear point for me is that there are often times where, especially in that moment, especially emotionally, I react to something in a way that I don't wish to be reacting to. So I might react more severely or more hostilely than I actually want from an outcome perspective. And in that moment, it is extremely difficult to process differently there. So for me, that describes ego, that kind of pushback in a way, often emotionally, that's going to detract from my ability to advance towards something that is a bigger, kind of larger goal for me.
I think there's something more than just pushback too, because the idea of losing a part of your identity, changing facts that you base your idea around, there's like an inherent violence and pain in that process too. It's much more deeper emotionally, right?
So, I'm sorry, I'm not understanding. Say that again.
Well, like, I guess we're dancing around the idea of willpower and ego. I guess there's two concepts. Willpower is this idea that we can self-motivate ourselves to overcome resistance mentally. And then ego is this, I guess it's the internal force that directs the willpower. How would you describe it in that relationship?
I see ego as a really self-protective force, right? This is the part that, says like, I'm the shit, that says when that guy says something that I don't want to hear, fuck that guy, he doesn't know what the fuck he's talking about. It's this thing that kind of lets you move forward with this positive kind of identity around yourself, right? And
yeah, it lets you exist in the space. It is your positive impact on the space around you.
Yeah, and it's very helpful lots of times, right? But it also can get in the way. And my ego is useful to me when I can direct it, and less useful to me when I'm just kind of blindly bound by it. And there's absolutely points in my life that are hurt by allowing my ego free run of that. And identifying those points and working away from that has been useful to me long term in my life for getting results that I want.
Got it. I think that's a nice succinct way of putting it.
Cool. Cool.
Do you think it's inherently just the nature of ego makes it such that it's hard for it to change? Or like, I don't know, is there something incompatible there with having a flowing, adapting ego?
I think, at least for my understanding of ego, it's not so much like, it's not like you're going to have, how do I say this? I feel like what you do with an ego is you either suppress or embrace kind of the output from that based on what you're trying to accomplish with that. It's always going to be in the same direction. It's always going to be protective towards you, essentially. So, at least from my understanding of it, I guess I haven't looked up the definition of ego from like a psychological perspective in a very long time, despite talking about it. But I guess the one I'm working with is essentially those impulses that are pretty deep impulses that are often emotionally based impulses that are often not in the direction I want them to be going for outcomes. So, protective stuff like this guy dared to question my authority here, fuck him, or well, I'm not going to show a flaw here, or I'm just going to I'm going to quickly move past this thing that I've screwed up kind of deal, right? It's the ego for there.
Also, I saw chat wanted to ask questions, so if there are any questions, feel free.
All right, chat, what do we got over here? So someone asked to be clear, sexual disgust decreased as sexual arousal decreased. Yes, it's sexual disgust decreased as sexual arousal increased is the relationship there. So we had this was a survey people took at their home, and we had a sexual arousal manipulation. We basically asked people to reach a state of sexual arousal and then rate things, rate scales talking about disgusting items. The control group would then be people who weren't in sexual arousal, who were also looking at those same scales and rating them. We had them do a physical arousal thing to kind of tease that out. So we had some people doing a sexual arousal task, some people doing just like a physical arousal task, like getting the body moving kind of deal. And then they'd look at disgust scales for that study. All right, what else do we have in chat for questions?
Yes. I guess I have a follow-up question for that too, is I think I skimmed over this, but how did you induce the disgust? You just had them read passages?
We weren't manipulating disgust. We were manipulating sexual arousal.
Sorry, arousal.
Right. So sexual arousal manipulations were, well, again, the three group. We did an initially pilot study with 3 and then ended up with 2, right? And the 2 that ended up being were, I believe, physical arousal and sexual arousal. Sexual arousal is essentially use whatever method you want to get yourself into a state of sexual arousal. Come back when you've done that, report what the method was kind of deal. But we're not telling people one way or the other what to do for that. They're just basically coming back and saying, hey, I'm gonna raise state of sexual arousal. They give us kind of a scale of what that looks like for them, and then they're gonna go rate surveys for that.
Interesting.
Surveys about disgust. And then the disgust was multi-dimensional, right? So there was some disgust that was sexual domain, some disgust that was like pathogen domain, etc. Yeah.
And these are just like Likert scales. They're answering like 1 to 10. How do you feel?
Yeah, those were Likert scales. So some of the other research we've done has been looked at some other stuff. Probably my favorite piece of research that I worked on directly in graduate school was kink community research. I'm happy to explain it. Take me like 5 minutes if you want, but I'm happy to move on past. Okay. So do you know what a top or a bottom is in like a kink scene?
From your papers, yeah.
Okay. So one of the issues that you run into with research all the time is that most of your research is essentially correlational, especially when it comes to things like this, because it's very difficult to tell someone, let's assign you to some type of sexuality. We can't assign someone to like gay or straight, for example, right? You just can't do that. And you can't often assign people to these categories that you want. So you're stuck in this situation where you're looking at existing categories and then you're drawing and then you're connecting those to other things. This is correlational research in a nutshell, right? So you go, okay, well, there's a group over here that does kink. What about kink? And then you ask them personality variables, right? But the problem is it's correlational. You can't assign someone to be kinky or not, and therefore you can't get at the root causes of that. So one of the studies we did, which was interesting to me, was we recruited switches, who are a subset of BDSM practitioners who will either top or bottom, depending on various factors, but they do both essentially in their life. And then we looked at, and we randomly assigned them to either top or bottom for a scene. And then we took a shit ton of information from them, things like looking at saliva for cortisol and a bunch of Likert scale kind of self-response questions, et cetera. And we looked at essentially to tease apart the differences between what the bottoms and tops in these scenarios were doing. And I thought from the perspective of like clean methodology, I really liked that as looking at a causation kind of model, because we can actually experimentally place people into, or randomly assign people to groups, so we can actually draw conclusions about that, which was really, really, really cool from my perspective for a study.
So for the tops, bottoms, and switches, what is the percentage breakdown of people? Like, is 50% going top or bottom and staying there in that role their whole life, or
For
is there some
switches,
sort of...
switches tend to be on a kind of like a per session kind of thing, or sometimes a per partner kind of thing for switches. But in general, in the community, like a BDSM community, what is the percentage of tops and bottoms that you're asking me?
I guess because I'm just so unfamiliar with it. Like, how common is it for someone to go from being a top to a bottom? And does that necessarily mean they're going through the switch state?
There's no, okay. Let me think on that. I don't think there's a switch state necessarily. Switch is kind of an identity, right? You identify as someone who sometimes tops and sometimes bottoms, you're a switch. That's kind of what that means.
Got it.
So by utilizing this population, we got to ask questions of tops or bottoms and draw causal conclusions about that, because we weren't just essentially being like, hey, bottoms report this and tops report this. We can actually randomly assign them and therefore get rid of the variance that might have been there from that group kind of selection ahead of time, which was really, really nice.
Are switches a common thing in the BDSM community, or are they more on the rare side?
Rare.
Bottoms and tops?
Tends to mostly be tops or bottoms with some switches.
Understood.
Yeah. Which made our fucking end size super small, but say again?
One question in your chat here about single best policy or YouTube video that would prevent younger people from joining into echo chambers.
Single best possible policy or YouTube video watch or anything accessible which would prevent younger people from joining the echo chambers. That's so hard, man.
I feel like, for me at least, it has to be someone, like we talked about, you need someone who you're open to hearing ideas from. So maybe someone whose content you enjoy normally, that has similar views, that, you know, can get you out of that. But again, it comes down to your will probably, right? If you don't want to, well, if you're more gravitating toward that sort of information, you're naturally going to get into an echo chamber of some kind around it.
Yeah, man. It's so hard because the whole fucking algorithm is designed to keep feeding you stuff down the interest that you express in something, and feeding you more and more essentially agitating versions of that, right? So I think maybe there's the step back for me would be to try to be critical. You're trying to be a critical thinker about all the things that are important in your life. That's just how you should be doing anyways. So trying to hear other sides, other opinions, and then evaluating based on a more rounded picture, as opposed to just accepting and regurgitating what you hear, is really going to be beneficial for that. And if I had to give a rule of thumb for YouTube, I would, or that type of thing, I'm a huge fan of long form conversational podcasts, right? And it's not a guaranteed rule. You'll still find shit that's only echo chamber in a long form podcast for sure. But when you actually get well-intentioned actors sitting there talking to one another about complicated subjects, there's a lot of time in that type of conversation for nuance to come out, and a lot of time for positions to be defined, and for you to understand the larger piece of information that's being presented, as opposed to the soundbite or the 2-second conclusion. So for me, that's a really good way to do that. You're still stuck, you know, where you get that resource from and what other resources it redirects you to. But the goal is essentially listening for bullshit. And when you hear stuff that doesn't sound right, trying to follow up on why it doesn't sound right, what's wrong with it, what are the options, what are the other things. I mean, this is actually really interesting for Destiny's content, right? Which is sometimes his positions, I'm like, what the fuck kind of position is that? And then sooner or later he ends up defending that on some platform. And I don't always agree with him, but I appreciate that he spent the time to look past the surface level and be like, here's 4 steps down the road why that policy that you're suggesting, that super nice virtue signaling thing that seems really positive on the face, doesn't really work 3 steps later, you know?
And also, no one can ever accuse Destiny of being bad faith, at least in my opinion. I can disagree with him on many things, but he's always arguing with good intentions. And I think that's the main thing I would take away, is that you need to engage with good actors always. You have to watch good content. You have to be aware of what content you're consuming, because those people aren't going to change to suit what's best for your information. They're going to change to suit what's best for the growth of their channel. That's not always beneficial for you.
Yeah, and I think Twitch is maybe not a good position, particularly to engage in this shit, anyways, because people are in there for the wrong motivations. But I mean, ultimately, yeah, you should always be a good faith actor, because ultimately, what that suggests is you have confidence in your arguments, right? The minute you are misrepresenting either your opposition or yourself deliberately, why you're doing this is because you don't think you can get the fucking work done with the tools you have available to you. You know, and like that in itself to me feels like an admission of failure, right? If you're not confident enough, or you don't believe fully enough in the quality of your argumentation, then you resort to something else. You look, you know, so this is like, what is it, peripheral versus central fucking route of like reaching someone, right? You're gonna try these peripheral influence routes, things like, you know, fallacious appeals to authority, or you know, virtue signaling kind of shit, because you don't think that your central persuasion route works. So I don't know. It seems to me inherently to be a problem if you're engaging in bad faith with something. It's inherently undermining the look of your belief in your idea.
I think the mix up between entertainment too has been so damaging. Like, people can take Alex Jones and see him as truth, entertainment, a character. It's so, everything is so gray now, especially with technology advancing to deep fakes and machine learning.
Jesus, that's
you have
scary.
you have to be more aware than ever what you're watching, who's writing it, what their intent is, because it's all there to manipulate you,
Yeah.
whether or not you know it.
Yeah, I think a healthy degree of skepticism has been really helpful in my life.
Well, yeah, skepticism has like two swords to it too, because now I have people who are so overly skeptical that they won't trust anything they see in a newspaper, but they will take the faceless blogger at face value.
Yeah.
I have had to fight a lot of people in my life on issues like that.
Skeptical and consistent, perhaps, is the other one that needs to be there then. Sure.
Yeah, you have to be consistent, get different source of information, but again, it all comes down to their willpower, I guess, wanting to be informed.
Yeah. Yeah. Hey man, I really appreciate you reaching out to me. I don't know if this is going to be the type of thing that you do in general, but I had fun with this. I think it's interesting coming back to some of these ideas that I haven't really spoken about publicly in a while, or thought about publicly like this. I feel like I could have done a little bit better job of perhaps having some more coherent answers, but I kind of got a little bit lost in answering some of the questions you were asking, as opposed to understanding the concept maybe.
Yeah, I could have narrowed those down a bit more. I think it's nice seeing a more human side, and some of your other experiences outside of gaming too. Because for a while, I did know you just as the Civ 5 person on YouTube that I watch videos for, and then seeing you be able to engage in these deeper topics definitely opened up the idea that I could learn more than just gaming related content from Twitch people.
Yeah.
That is one thing I definitely want to see more on Twitch.
Me too. I don't quite know what that looks like. Sometimes I like Destiny's content, and sometimes I just want to like slam my face into a fucking wall to get away from it, because some of these positions are so impossible to have conversations in. But I am cautiously optimistic that this platform can do some stuff with that type of information. Maybe is the answer. For now, I mostly stick to long form podcasts, but maybe Twitch.
I would agree. I think long form is the only thing we can do at this point, because as long as you're going to bite-sized clips, Twitter, anything that can be taken out of context, it will and can be used against you in some way. So
well, it's also not
I'm glad
particularly.
you're able...
Go ahead. Sorry.
Go ahead.
I was just gonna say, it's not surprising, right? Like, all the things that are actually important to your life are almost always somewhat complicated. It isn't surprising that the solutions or things that impact those are also fairly complicated and require some thought on. That seems to make inherent sense to me, right? Happiness in life, your success at a career, these things have a little bit of extra thought time with them. So it makes sense that the conversations around them are also going to need to be longer, or a little bit more in depth to be useful.
Exactly, yeah. Some things can't be simplified down, and when you do try to rephrase them in 280 characters or less, you lose so much that the signal to noise ratio is too far off to learn from.
Yeah, I think so. Anyways, I really appreciate you reaching out.
Yeah, it was a very good conversation. I'll reach out in the future, but we'll see what happens with these. Maybe I'll do some more of them. If you have anyone else that you talked to that influenced you or you learned a lot from, I would definitely want to speak to them at some point too. If you could DM me them.
Yeah, sounds good, man.
All right, have a nice day.
Yeah, you too, Chris. Nice meeting you.
See ya.
Later. You seem like a really well-spoken guy. I don't know how these are going as a whole. I like I like thinking about things and I like having conversations about things. So it's kind of fun to do it on stream. I haven't really tried doing these on stream much before, but they are things that I enjoy. I have to find more people interested in doing that. And the topic list seems to be really key. Conversation flows pretty well when there's a series of things to talk about, and less so when it doesn't. Yeah, cheers, Best Boy. Appreciate you coming on and reaching out to me, man. It's a little, I don't know, like a part of me, the kind of the perfectionist part of me, the graduate student part of me, the person in higher education part of me, feels a little uncomfortable thinking off the cuff about these things. Like a part of me wants to go point to research, and another part of me is like, well, if I have that mentality for everything, I can't have conversations about this necessarily. There's a value to that, but there's also a detriment to that. So I don't know, I always feel a little bit like the expertise part of me wants to be like, hey, look, here's how things are, let me tell you these things. So I feel like with these, I almost need to caveat a fuck ton and be like, look, I'm mostly thinking about this from personal experience, looking at things that work in my life, and some of these things are going to be useful and some aren't to other people.